There is a silence that comes before the world rearranges itself, a hush so deep that even the sea seems to hold its breath. In April of 1815, on a tropical island far from the capitals and cartographers of Europe, the quiet broke with a sound that would be heard around the world, not as an echo, but as a change in the weather itself. On the island of Sumbawa, in what is now Indonesia, Mount Tambora tore open. For nearly 3 days, the mountain belched and convulsed. Rivers of fire raced down its flanks. Villages were engulfed in the roar of pyroclastic flows, their roofs and trees and people swept away as if painted out of the landscape. The mountain's summit fell in, and a caldera was left where a peak had been, a wound more than 6 kilometers across, a new basin that would hold the memory of the eruption in its silence. Ash fell like a gray rain. The sky went dark. For those who lived closest, the world ended and began again in the space of a heartbeat. The immediate toll was immense and intimate. Entire villages on the slopes and along the coasts were destroyed. Tens of thousands lost their lives not only to the heat of the blast, but to the choking, suffocating ash that filled homes and mouths. Those numbers, the local dead, are the first raw shape of the disaster, perhaps 10 to 12,000 killed outright in the eruption and the immediate aftermath. But the mountain's violence did not stop at the ocean's edge. What Tambora released did not belong to a single island. It belonged to the atmosphere. When a volcano of that power erupts, it's not only rock and lava that it ejects, it lofts a chemical cloak into the stratosphere, vast quantities of sulfur-rich gases that astonish the sky. Those gases oxidize into fine droplets of sulfate, a veil that scatters and reflects sunlight. The sun did not go out, but its warmth was blunted. Daylight softened, summers thinned. The resulting global dimming would come to be called, with a bluntness worthy of the times, the year without a summer. To understand the scale is to imagine the planet wearing a thin, pale shawl. That veil hung in the atmosphere for months, and its effects were not confined to the tropics. Temperatures fell across the northern hemisphere. In Europe, in North America, in parts of Asia, the season slipped. In New England, in June and July, snow fell, white on fields that should have been green with grain. Frosts visited in midsummer. In Switzerland and the British Isles, persistent rain and cold rotted crops in the ground and blighted the harvests people had calculated upon. Across northern latitudes, the growing season contracted and the pantry sagged. The human consequences arrived with a swiftness that climate numbers can't fully capture. Bread is not a statistic. It is a handful of heat and a child's quiet. Where harvests failed, hunger sharpened into crisis. Food prices jumped, harvested stores spoiled in wet fields. In rural lowlands, cattle and sheep died or were slaughtered and eaten in desperation. When the price of grain rose, it tore at the social fabric. Food riots, migration, and the slow, grinding spread of disease as malnourished communities became vulnerable. Estimates of deaths caused by the famine and related hardships following Tambora's eruption run into the tens of thousands, swelling the count of the disaster's victims far beyond the mountain's immediate shadow. Some historians and contemporary accounts suggest totals around 70,000 lost in the months and years that followed, a number that folds together what happened locally with the far-reaching reverberations of a changed climate. And yet to tell this as only catastrophe is to miss the way human lives were braided with that weather. The cold, the rain, the extended gloom, these were not abstractions. They rearranged choices. They pushed people to move. They opened doors for migration to the Americas, for families to cross oceans in search of food and new ground. They altered economies, shifted labor, and reframed political anxieties about scarcity and dependence. Poor harvests fed unrest in some regions and led to innovations in others. Farmers tried new crops, craftspeople diversified their trades, and communities that survived learned to read the air differently. Those same clouds that carried famine also carried inspiration. The summer of 1816 was a bad one for vacations. A small group of English and Scottish writers found themselves confined by the rain beside Lake Geneva. Lord Byron, the poet, the medical student John Polidori, the young Mary Godwin, who would become Mary Shelley. The afternoons were long and gray. Conversation turned inward. It was in that damp, incandescent atmosphere that Mary Shelley was given a challenge to write a ghost story. The result, conceived in the shadow of cold and relentless overcast, would become Frankenstein, a tale that is as much about the limits of human ambition as it is about the body of the earth itself. To read that novel is to feel a kind of climate in its pages, the sense that weather, mood, and the inarticulate forces of nature can shape thought and art as much as they shape harvests. There is a quiet science behind the drama. When Tambora erupted, it injected material high into the stratosphere, a region where particles can stay aloft for a long time, circling the globe before settling. Ordinary storms cannot wash these particles down. The atmosphere is stratified, and the sulfate aerosols formed a diffuse veil. By scattering sunlight, they reduce the amount of solar energy reaching the surface, lowering temperatures by a few tenths of a degree on average across the globe. That number, a fraction of a degree, may sound modest, but climate is a system of balances. Seasonal thresholds, insect life cycles, and the timing of plant growth all respond to small shifts. The result in 1816 was a cascade: floods and frosts in some regions, droughts elsewhere, plankton blooms altered, and harvests failing in places that might once have been reliable. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica hold a fingerprint of that event, a spike of sulfate deposited in the layers of snow, a slow record of a fast catastrophe. Tambora also reframed how we think about human agency in the face of planetary processes. It taught the Enlightenment's children that industrial progress and human inventions are fragile in the face of geologic force, that the meter of human plans can be shortened by a volcanic cloud. It showed, too, that the planet is a tightly connected system. An eruption at the equator could set the tables in Boston, Beckley, and Geneva. There is a geography to memory. On Sumbawa, for generations, Tambora's shadow shaped stories and rebuilt homes. The island's map was redrawn by ash and relocation. Elsewhere, the mountain was a whisper in the margins of cookbooks and a footnote in emigration records. In art and literature, in the economic policies of governments responding to grain shortages, in the migrations that would repopulate distant coasts, the eruption's touch was everywhere, sometimes subtle, sometimes blunt. Modern scientists look back and read Tambora like an instruction about the climate's sensitivity and its levers. Comparing Tambora to later events, Krakatoa in 1883, Mount Pinatubo in 1991, helps researchers piece together how much aerosol and what distribution produces what effect. That knowledge is not academic, it's practical. It informs how we think about geoengineering, about volcanic risk, and about preparedness for climate extremes. It reminds us that human lives are nested inside planetary systems that operate on scales both sudden and slow. This story is also quietly a story of adaptation. Communities learn to harvest differently, to store grain in new ways, to interpret a fickle sky. Scientists and travelers would come later to catalog and study, to build the early instruments that would make weather and climate legible. In the debris of crisis, new practices grew. And in art and memory, a cultural shift took root, an awareness that the world's mood could change in a single season, and that every person's year could be remapped by a storm they did not call. When we look back from our own future-facing present, Tambora asks a small, persistent question. How well do we attend to the forces we can't see? The mountain's ash did not obey the lines of nations that humans draw. It was blind to borders and indifferent to human hierarchies. It reminds us that the climate is not an equation to be solved by a single hand, but a shared condition we inhabit together. There is grief in this story, for the lives lost and the livelihoods overturned. There is also a kind of stern instruction. The planet's changes are neither moral nor personal, they are consequential. From a mountain's thunder came a global lesson about fragility and connection, about how quickly what we take for granted can become a scarcity. And yet, even in the gray summer of 1816, people gathered, wrote, moved, and survived. They turned famine into migration, fear into invention, and a gloomy season into stories that would cross centuries. If you stand now on that changed rim, the caldera rim, or at the edge of a map, it is hard not to feel the double pulse of awe and humility. The earth can remake its face in an instant, but the human heart remakes the world in the slow work of recovery and memory. To look at Tambora is to see both forces at once: the swift, implacable power of geology and the stubborn, creative persistence of people. We live in a time when the sky can change because of faraway events, when a single eruption can alter harvests and histories. Remembering Tambora is not only to mourn a loss that happened 2 centuries ago. It is to be instructed by a mountain that stole a summer, and in doing so retold the story of who we are when the predictable seasons fail us. The past, like the air, is never entirely gone. It circulates, cools, and returns, carrying with it the shape of our choices. In that circulating memory lies a quiet hope, that knowing the mountain's power, we might act together with more care toward the fragile climate that holds us all.